So recently, one of our friends put up a post about the ultimate hip mobility program. What I want to do is just create a kind of a PSA for how we think about evaluating a mobility program. So the first thing we should do is define the word mobility. So when we look at the word mobility, which frankly is now a word like the word core, just sort of non-specific, let's be specific about the goals, the details. So when we define it, one of the things that we're seeing is that one is that we want to have the requisite range of motion, and you can think of that as this tissue. Do I have the tissue capacity to do that? Am I stiff? Do my joint capsules work? Is my fascia stuck, right? Range of motion plus movement control. And what we should be thinking at, you could call this motor control, movement control, but another word for this is technique. So one of the first things that we should be thinking about as we're working on sort of evaluating a program is looking to see if people in their movement program, their general movement program, are touching the normative ranges of motion. So the first thing we have to do is sort of go back into what people are doing and say, well, are they exposing themselves to full range of motion or the positions of shapes required to be human? So for example, if I'm looking at someone's programming and I don't see much hip extension in the program, then it doesn't matter how much excellent range of motion drills I do or assistance work I do or movement transfer exercises or corrective exercises do in flexion, I'm always going to lack potentially the range of motion to be able to take my hip into extension, which is kind of a crucial position. And secondarily, I definitely will not have the movement control or the technique to be able to hang out in those positions or control those positions, okay? So first order of business is if someone's like, it's the ultimate shoulder rehab program, but you don't see any shoulder extension in the program, that's a problem. If it's the ultimate shoulder rehab program or shoulder mobility program, and you don't see any internal rotation in this hang shape, that's gonna be a problem. We do a lot of things grabbing this bar and swinging and that, right? So you get the idea here. So one of the things that we can start to do then is that when someone's looking at that program, we also, in our language, we take what we call a systems approach. So we think in terms of systems. Now there is a lot of overlap in this systems idea. But in short, let me give it to you, how we think about it. When we look at these range of motion issues around the tissues, we think, is this a sliding surface problem? So sometimes skin doesn't slide over tendons or over bones. We have osteofascial dysfunction, right? The bones are stiff or the skin is stiff. The fascia doesn't slide very well. Nerves don't slide through nerve tunnels. A lot of the myofascial mobilization and the scrubbing and the things that we see people doing, even cupping or voodoo flossing, these are ideas around trying to restore how these tissues slide and glide. And look at Thomas Myers and anatomy trains and sort of fascial theory, and you'll appreciate very much soft tissue mobilization is very much about mobilizing fascia, not breaking up scar tissue, not stretching fascia, mobilizing fascia. That's one. Two, is this a muscle dynamic problem? So we regularly see that people, for whatever reason, have musculature that has been controlled by the brain that may become adaptively short. So we don't actually stretch muscles. What we're trying to do is reset a resting length tension relationship in that musculature so that we can then have a longer resting position. So tissues that are adaptively short or weak, for example, either one, adaptively short, stiff, weak, may not be expressing their normative ranges. And the last time I checked, even people like Shirley Sarwan said, hey, we never stretch anyone. In fact, I don't want to stretch anyone. I don't want you to be stretched. I don't want you to be loosey-goosey, right? A rubber band overstretched. Doesn't work. But we do see stiffness in those tissues, and we see very much that tackling end range isometrics teaches me control at these end ranges of position, right? Getting ideas like contract, relax, the World Center or that concept of PNF, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, where I can maybe build tension to reset or change how my brain is perceiving that muscle. But also we just see stiff muscles. Muscles just get stiff sometimes, not tight, not short, stiff. They just get stiff. We see stiff quads all the time in our athletes, right? So our detrained population, not so stiff. Highly trained population, just good old-fashioned stiffness. That's the second component. Third component to this kind of range of motion issue is that we think about the joint capsule. So if we're not addressing capsular restrictions in especially things like the hips, we will never quite get what we're after, right? Sometimes the capsule can account for huge amounts of range of motion restriction. So you can foam roll it, you can PNF it, but you've never ever addressed the hip capsule or the capsular restriction, and that's why we use bands. That's why Maitland invented his technique. That's why Mulligan does Mulligan stuff. That's why most of the best therapists we see are thinking in the systems approach, right? And of course there's overlap in the systems. If I restore a joint capsule, oftentimes I see downstream effects on how the nervous system is regulating the musculature, and we see changes in fascia. So you can come in from the bottom, you can come in from the top. It doesn't matter. You're gonna have to think about how one system affects the other system, okay? We also think about the movement system. And if you've been around for a second with us, we're always prioritizing movement first. So even in mobilizations like something that look classic, like we even call it the couch stretch, even though it's not a stretch, it's really an end range isometric piece where we're trying to take a tissue into a position of emphasis and then build some contraction there, making sure that we can use some of the tricky neurologic effects of getting our brains involved, and we're just loading the tissues at the end range. These are positions that we should own, so let's start spending time at these end ranges, right? But if we don't have that movement component in there, if we're not teaching squatting technique, if we're not teaching lunging, we're not teaching people to control that, we can mobilize, and it doesn't work as effectively as making sure they're maxing out in the range. But after working with athletes for 2 decades, what we know is that more squats sometimes don't beget more squats. In fact, doing squat-like things or correlates for squats don't always improve squats. And so, again, appreciating that we want to honor the fact that there are so many ways to improve human function, so many ways to improve output. And that's really the game. Biomotor expression, biomotor output is the only thing we care about. Can you get there efficiently? Can you get there effectively? Is it in the same language in which you're trained, or it's another correlate language? Do we have to do a ton of exercises, of skill transfer exercises, of corrective exercises to come back to squat? Or can I squat and mobilize the squat, et cetera? So however you want to come into that, whatever language you like is up to you. And the last component we're always focusing on, of course, is environment. Sleep, hydration, nutrition. Do I feel safe? My thinking, right? All of those things. Am I in a tribe? All of those things, arousal matters here, right? So when you're evaluating someone's system, if you're just seeing a lot of movement, then that's great. That's a one fantastic way in to restore a lot of positions. So if you're seeing people do a lot of, glute bridges or resistance through a band, right? Those are movements, and slowing down tempo is certainly a great way to teach the brain to appreciate a position, right? We hide a lot of detritus, a lot of dysfunction under speed, and when we slow down, brain has to pay attention, for sure. So, but as you're working through someone's systems approach, if you're not seeing people pay attention to rotation, right? Because the joint just doesn't go forward and back, it also rotates. So if you're not seeing rotational control in there, if you're not seeing restoration of rotation, if you're not mobilizing or at least spending time restoring these positions in the language of all movement. So if you see 5 drills on an ultimate hip mobility reset or the ultimate hip mobility challenge, and you don't see any hip extension there's a hole in the program. If someone's talking about ultimate shoulder overhead and you don't see a lot of overhead time, you have an incomplete program. And lastly, this is crucial, is that one, yes, all roads lead to Rome. Test, retest is the only thing we care about. Is it effective? Is it fast? Did you experience change? Did that change express itself in biomotor output? Could you lift further? Could you go faster? Right? Those are the things we care about. Could you go longer, greater economy? But it's crucial that people establish what their range of motion goals are. Because we see on the internet a lot of people spending time doing a lot of work, a lot of busy work, a lot of movement-like things, which are great for tendons and great for proprioception. But they never are moving towards a goal, which is the normative physiologic range that every Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons puts out, the Academy of Family Practitioners, Norkin and White, the physical therapists, the chiros, we all agree within about 5 degrees of what normative range of motion is. You should be able to flex your hip 120 to 135 degrees, period. And so if you don't see tests into there, then what we see is a lot of people doing a lot of work, getting very excited. A new stimulus changes some way that the brain is adapting to something, but it may not get to the bottom of the thing. So don't cherry pick people's programs. You want to say, hey, are we addressing a systems approach here? Do we have movement in there? Are we working on these soft tissue system components to the mobility, range of motion, and movement? And then are we actually exposing ourselves in our restoration positions? Remember, you can either come in through skill, however you want to do it. You can come in through, position transfer exercises, like mobilizations plus work. You can come in through skill transfer exercises, corrective exercises plus work. But if you're not exposing yourself to full range of motion during your drills or assistance works, you're going to have a hole in your program. If you don't clearly establish start and finish positions and have clear range of motion goals, then you're just continuing to do a bunch of work. And that's fine, of course, but we're trying to respect your time. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of how, when we look in the internet and see how very clever people are trying to solve problems, take a step further, go past the first picture about what someone's doing or railing against, take a look at what the system is, and then be thinking to yourself, is it a systems approach? Is it respecting all of these kind of categories that make up complex human movement, including environment, all those things? And does it have clear movement goals? Do we have restoration? Because if someone can hit their range of motion, has control there, we don't need to work on it. We don't need to do something else. In fact, we don't even count it. Like my Olympic lifters oftentimes have great control overhead, and my gymnasts have great control overhead, and it's not the things we're working on. Hopefully that helps.